Enjoy your production.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Now we're going to move on to Patrice's presentation. Patrice will tell us a little bit about herself, and we're moving from the more specific to a little bit more of a general presentation about behaviour. Thanks, Patrice.
Now, my first question is, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Okay. Hello, everybody. Yes, it's Patrice Wiseman speaking, and I'm a learning consultant in behaviour for what used to be called Catholic Education Melbourne, and we're now called Melbourne Archdiocese Catholic Schools, or MACS is our acronym. I've been in education for just a little while. This is my 52nd year, so I'm in the twilight stages of my career, and about 30 of those years have been in the area of specifically managing and supporting students with social and emotional difficulties who are therefore acting out behaviourally. A lot of that was in a specific setting, and more recently in the last 5 or 6 years, I've moved into the central office and now into the southern region office. So schools can actually make referrals to us if they want support in helping to manage a child's behaviour. So I'm going to be talking to you about positive behaviour support, and my screen has just decided to freeze. Oh no. I'm just going to do a stop share for a minute and see if that makes any difference. My computer has decided to freeze and it's not moving the screen.
Oh.
Oh.
Would you like us to move on to Mairead and come back to you, Patrice?
I'll just try it one more time, because for some reason...
Technology.
I know, don't you love it? No, it's not happening.
I'm going to jump in with a totally untechnical solution, but sometimes I found that just if I go between touching the arrow key on my keyboard and then back to the mouse, sometimes it works, but that's
okay.
Very untechnical.
Let me try then. So arrow key and back to the mouse. Oh,
it's working.
There you go, magic. How about that? Thank you, Kristen.
No
That's a trick I'll keep up my sleeve. My apologies, everyone, although it wasn't my fault. So what I wanted to start with when we're talking about behaviour support, very quickly, those little pot plants actually represent my journey through education. When I first started teaching 52 years ago, good, strong discipline was modelled to me. It was in the days when we told kids off, we shook our finger at them, we gave them a lecture, we used the words naughty and bad. And I look back now and I think, honestly, what on earth were we thinking? And then probably around about 10 years after I began teaching, so more sort of into around late 70s, early 80s, good old Lee and Marlene Cantor from America came up with a style of discipline that they called assertive discipline. And whilst we've moved on from that, at the time, it actually gave those of us in education a framework to work with and to work for. And there are a lot of actual strategies that Lee and Marlene Cantor implemented within assertive discipline, some of which we do still carry forward today, and I'll talk about some of them in a moment. So then we move on further and we have amazing developments in education, such as restorative practices. And I know that Kristen will be nodding her head. She, like me, is a great advocate of the restorative approach, which really says, we had it wrong in schools for years. We were punitive, and therefore when we were telling kids off and punishing them, they were thinking more about what was being done to them than what we wanted them to think about, which is how their behaviour and their choices of behaviour somehow have affected another or maybe others. And what can they do to try and restore that relationship and make things right? And for me, that was probably a pivotal time in my career when my whole thinking about behaviour management, as we were calling it back then, or probably still discipline, began to change. And so with the restorative in mind, and that, that key belief that every instance of correcting behaviour needs to be a teaching and learning situation for that child. So we move then into the concept of behaviour management, and we've called it that, moved away from discipline into behaviour management. We've called it that for many, many years, until more recently, when we realised that even the term management has a connotation of top down. And so we've moved now into what we call behaviour support. If you think about kids in the learning environment, regardless of whether it's primary or secondary, we don't manage their learning, we support them in their learning. And that's exactly what we hopefully do behaviourally. So this looks a bit of a busy screen, but this is really your recipe to take forward. And I am just going to whiz through some of these things. Good old John Hattie, an amazing educator who was really, really adamant in describing the fact that orderly classrooms will guarantee higher student engagement and therefore learning outcomes. And so we need to translate, well, what does that look like then? As a teacher, what do I need to be able to bring into my classroom to make that happen? First of all, we have to understand that link between behaviour and learning outcomes. You're never going to have a child or a student who is behaving inappropriately who's then going to be totally engaged in their learning, and neither will it happen the other way. Our own skills as a teacher, our own attitude, our own behaviour and what we're modelling, absolutely vital. You'll hear the term explicit teaching again and again and again in your career. We accepted academically that we need to explicitly teach kids academic content, but we also have to explicitly teach them how to behave. We can't just assume that kids come into our school settings, even at secondary school level, knowing how to behave. Home is the primary educator, and without sounding judgmental, sadly, a lot of the values that we would hope our kids are getting in the home environment, many of them are not. You've only got to take manners, pleases and thank yous as an example of that. Building positive relationships, that goes to the heart of restorative practices. I have to build a relationship with each and every child. There are going to be kids who rub you up the wrong way and that you don't take to as easily. That is a fact. There have been many of them for me in 52 years of teaching, but that child would never ever know. Because if anything, I've worked harder to establish a relationship with that child, particularly if they've been exhibiting problematic behaviour. So we need to create very predictable learning environments, because that's when kids feel safe. And I'll be embellishing that a little bit more in a moment when I pick up on what Cindy and Jared were talking about, and that is the need for routines. So the learning climate in any classroom, and for that matter in the school, the more positive that it is, the more we are teaching kids the core values of our expectations. We need to also accept that for many children, we are actually educating them socially because they're showing significant social skill deficits, and emotionally. Many kids, you've only got to pick up the paper to read about how many of our children are presenting with anxiety. So we need to be as committed to social and emotional teaching and their learning as we are to their academic learning as well. Simple things like the organisation of learning spaces, and then a systematic approach to responding to behaviour. So what that means is clarity, which I'll tease out a little bit as we go further. Knowing your students, absolutely vital. I do apologise to those of you who are secondary or training as secondary, because I'm looking at my visuals and everything's primary. So I apologise. I could just as easily have, in fact, when I talk to secondary schools, I do have some other images. I have to understand that behaviour is about communication. Something will happen before an inappropriate behaviour is demonstrated. That's the antecedent. The behaviour occurs, and then there'll be a consequence. And by that, I don't mean the old-fashioned punishment. I mean something happens afterwards. So besides the immediate context of behaviour, there can be lots of other factors that might be contributing to that student's behaviour. And I'm not going to read them, but here they come. That list is not exhaustive. There's probably things that I haven't included there that we need to know. You know, diagnosis just being one of them. Autism is also one of my specialties, and I've actually sat down with teachers in our system when a child has been referred and listened to what they're saying, and I've been scratching my head and thinking, this little person really sounds as though they're showing a lot of autistic tendencies. And when I've asked that question, I've had, oh yeah, actually I think he might have been diagnosed on the spectrum. Not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. If the child is in my care, it is my responsibility to know as much as I can about them. That includes reading any reports that have been provided by specialists, and that'll be something that when you have your own class in front of you, that will be part of your professional responsibility. When you first go out into the teaching field and you have your own class, one of the pitfalls, many of us, when we first start off, we want to be popular. We want the kids to like us. Fatal mistake. We are not there to be their friend. We can be friendly to students, and we should, because it creates a warm environment in which they can learn, but we are not their friend. And if ever you are in a situation, and many young teachers will be, particularly with older students, but not necessarily, some little ones, Miss, have you got a boyfriend? And to feel very comfortable to say, that's actually none of your business. Or I won't be answering that question, it's not appropriate. So drawing that line in the sand, think about what you are happy to share. And these days we have a lot of oversharing on social media. Maybe some of you are sitting there cringing, thinking that's me. You need to be really careful with what you are prepared to share with children and what you know is the line in the sand, because they will overstep it often. And we as the adults need to be the ones to make sure that we are clear with them about what's appropriate and what's not. So when you go into any school on placement or further down the track when you actually take up your own positions in a school, hopefully, you will be aware of the school, we used to call them rules. We've actually moved away because rules has a connotation stuck in the punitive of you will obey. So we tend to call them expectations, which has a connotation of we'll commit to these. Cindy and Jared talked about their core values. I really like that as well. So school-wide expectations, or what maybe your school might be still calling rules, what are they? They're the guiding principles that clearly communicate the school's expectations or core values, if you want to call them that, for positive behaviours in all school environments. I absolutely hammer this when I talk to staff about it, because there is your code of conduct. So whatever those expectations are, they might be things like we follow directions, we keep our hands, feet to ourselves, we speak appropriately, we listen when others are speaking, or they might be broader values like respect, responsibility, and so on. Whatever they are, what I can promise you is if you pick up on them and you absolutely commit to positively reinforcing them, you are using one of the most important tools. Research tells us specific targeted positive acknowledgement and feedback is the most powerful tool in changing behaviour and in sustaining that change. Simple little examples. You'll hear things in education in literacy called sentence stems. Well done for following that direction straight away. I really like the way that people at this front table have their eyes on me and are ready to listen. It's great to see that everyone stopped when I clapped to give the next instruction. So those three little examples are what we call sentence stems. And if you embed them in your practice and use them to positively reinforce the kids who are giving you the behaviour you want to see, you will be amazed at how effective that can be. I'm a very fast talker, as you can hear. I think I've got 5. Is that right, Anne?
Yes, that's about right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, research also tells us that the teacher, that's you, is the most significant factor in the student's school life. And many of us who are on the panel will have been in a situation that I've been in I couldn't tell you how many times, as recently as the day before at the supermarket checkout, saw this man staring at me. I actually felt a little uncomfortable. And I dropped the lemon and he bent down and picked it up for me. And as he handed it to me, he said, "Mrs. Wiseman." And as soon as he said that, I thought, okay, we're going back about 30 or 40 years, because I haven't been called that in education for about 30 years. And sure enough, I taught him in grade 5 about 40 years ago. Now, I would never have known him, but he remembered me, gave me a lovely compliment and said I hadn't changed much other than my hair's a lot grayer. But the point that I'm making is, when we are a teacher, we have the capability of touching the lives of each and every child within our care. And the fact that he went out of his way when I didn't recognize him to actually initiate that recognition and that contact really spoke volumes to me, because if I had have been one of the teachers he hated the most, he probably wouldn't have initiated it. So our body language, our facial expression, our tone of voice, our proximity, our choice of words, the volume we use, all of which are things that we talk about in restorative practices, so important, particularly when we are correcting kids. And this statement, I think, is gold. In every interaction with a student, will my words and actions either weaken or deepen my connection with that student? That's a real challenge when kids are challenging you. Cindy and Jared also talked about routines. One of my absolute pet loves. Without routines in a classroom, it's going to be chaotic. Kids don't know what's expected. In a year 5 classroom the other day, the teacher said, "Okay, guys, go and get your fruit," and sat at the table and was doing, I don't know, whatever. World War III broke out in the corridor. She had no idea what happened because she wasn't actively supervising it. In a classroom, a year 2 classroom the week before, same instruction was given. Grade 2s, in a moment you're going to go and get your fruit. Remember, what does our expectation say? We move and act safely. Teacher walked to the door. The kids came out quietly. She could see them in the corridor getting their fruit out of their bag, and she could also see them as they came back into the classroom. It's called active supervision. It's a great example of a really clear routine. So as it says on my screen, it's vital to establish and teach routines, particularly for transitions. Research will tell us transitions are one of the most problematic times. And Cindy and Jared talked about that. How are the kids delivered from the homeroom classroom to the specialist room and so on? But even within your own classroom, are the kids clear about, if they're primary school students, have you got a clear routine for things like handing up their learning tasks, coming to the floor, moving around the room? For older kids, have you got clear routines in place for being able to transition from one lesson to another? One good example that they also gave you a few examples of is what I call an attention grabber. And an attention grabber is whatever I'm going to do to let my students know that I want them to stop what they're doing because I'm going to give an instruction. Again, when I'm in lots of classrooms, the teacher will say 1, 2, 3, and the kids are meant to answer eyes on me. Now, those of you going into secondary schools, I can tell you now that won't go down well with year 10 boys. Might be something more like waterfall, 1, 2, 3, waterfall, and the kids with their fingers are meant to pretend they're a waterfall. Shh. What I will tell you is that whatever attention grabber you use, stick with the one. Don't change from one to another to another. But not only that, the first time you use that attention grabber in a good classroom, you've got about a third of the kids paying attention. 2/3 are continuing on with what they're doing. And yet that's when I see teachers giving the direction. You need to do that attention grabber 3 times, and each time we positively reinforce in between. So I've done it once. Well done to those people who stopped as soon as I asked. Let's try that again. 1, 2, 3. And the little ones answer, eyes on me. Well done, nearly everybody answered. Let's see if we can have everybody answering this time, and I do it a third. Now I know I've got pretty much every child's eyes on me and they're ready to listen. Therefore, they're more likely to follow the instruction. So just finishing up, the signpost is really important. If you read everything there, And then you look at the table, there's a team that are coming together. Maybe a particular student is demonstrating quite challenging behaviour. You are not expected to deal with those situations completely on your own. Don't be afraid to ask for help, ask for support, share with your mentor or somebody else that you're having difficulty with a particular class or with a particular student, and always with a view to understanding that each child, they're not only on an academic learning journey, they're on a behavioural learning journey. So the continuum in your classroom from the kids who have consolidated certain skills right through to those who are showing a skill deficit, very easy to accept that academically. We have to also accept that behaviourally. And those kids who are demonstrating a skill deficit in managing their own behaviour need help and support to be able to do that. So you've chosen a wonderful and rewarding, but at times challenging career. It's an absolute privilege to be in the lives of these children, but just accept that it is a journey for them behaviourally, and you are walking with them, and you are the strongest model of what pro-social behaviour looks like. So thanks, everybody. I think you can hear in my voice, it's my passion.
Thank you, Patrice. And I love the signpost at the end and the jigsaw puzzle on the table. And I think that's such important advice to seek support too.
Definitely.
So Zane, have we got any questions?
Not so far. From Ashini says, that was wonderful, thank you. And there's a thank you from somebody else who I haven't got their name. Any other questions from anybody?
So it was a wonderful follow-on from Jared and Cindy, and many of the same points coming through again.
Yep, thank you from Christian, thank you from Leah. So far, no questions.
Okay, well, keep your questions coming in. And remember, you can like somebody else's question if you'd like to move it to the top. We'll move on to Mairead, but Patrice is staying with us, so we can have time for questions at the end. So thank you, Mairead. Many of us know you from the interview that we viewed early in semester, and we'll welcome you back again.
Great, thanks Anne, and thanks everybody, and lovely, well I can't see you all, but lovely to know you're all there. So I just think that advice from those three people we've just heard from is outstanding in many ways. The whole thing around routines, around knowing your learner, around the framing of it positively, about connection, about taking every opportunity as a learning opportunity, because schools, of course, have all behaviours on show all day, every day, all the time in your face. And so we have to take them as a positive thing. And we all know, that the kids are all trying to be there and do the right thing, really. Some of them just need the coaching to get there. So we all get that because we all believe in learning, and we all know that learning matters, and we all have areas we can improve on. So yeah, thanks. It was just wonderful to hear from you all. So I just wanted to pick up quickly. I remember last time that I spoke to you about knowing learners, and this quick guide may have been sent out to you. I'm not sure, Anne, I can't remember, but it's just something that we use at my school, which I didn't start off reminding you that, but I'm at Collingwood English Language School. I'm the assistant principal there. So it's something that we sent out to all teachers to sit in their teams and talk about each learner, and just gave them prompting questions and 6 areas to think about in terms of the student's well-being. Now, just to step back around that, our school, I'll just remind you, is for newly arrived students. So many of the strategies that will work perfectly in a mainstream classroom where everyone speaks English and they're picking up the visual and so forth cues, may not work the same for us because we don't have the same language and the students are picking up different cultural cues, and some of them have never been to school before, some of them have been to a school for a bit and maybe been in a classroom where you don't say anything and you just listen, and some of them are fully schooled. So we have a really big mix of educational experiences. So I just need to remind you of that because a lot of my experience is quite unique in that regard at my school. So anyway, when we're looking at knowing your learners, I guess we're thinking about their physical health. So that may relate to disabilities as well, or any sort of, you know, vision, hearing, that kind of thing. That's always something to check in on. Often I've found a kid in a primary school especially where, you know, what's happening with their learning, and then you say, gee, have you had their hearing checked, or you had their sight checked, and that can be an issue. Mental health and emotional well-being. So as Patrice just said, of course, we are teaching social and emotional learning all the time, and that is something to really check in on and teach directly and do it in a restorative way, which I'm sure Kristen will talk about further. Their safety, are they safe at home, outside of school, in school? Are they feeling safe? Because if they are not, that is going to show in their behaviour. It will come out, it will be communicated either directly in language or in their behaviour. Their material well-being also, which may impact on their social and emotional state or on their safety. Their learning and development, how's that going, and how are their relationships? And this is a really important one with behaviour. So that's just a reminder, but yeah, I guess there are things around the behavioural issues in my setting that are going to be around students that have moved from another country. So I've touched on that. They've had different learning experiences or no learning experiences, and that can even be secondary students, and that's worth remembering. If you're working in an area such as mine around Hume, there may be students who have never been to school before they got to Australia and they're now in secondary school. There isn't necessarily common language. So I'll just preface this, but because I'm in a sort of an alternative setting. But if I saw a teacher do the death stare in my classroom, I know it wouldn't work, because the kids will not understand why it is. They won't know who it's being applied to. It would be perceived in many different ways. So although I absolutely appreciate that it's the right thing for Brighton Grammar and for many mainstream schools, it's not something that would happen at ours. And their attitude to learning. So that can often be a link to if their attitude to learning is that I can't learn, you know, deficit model, no growth mindset, or just shut down, and it could have been that their learning experience was only of getting into trouble in a refugee camp or a country where they're in transit, and it was not a positive experience, that can have an impact on behaviour. And of course, trauma in general, and that could be around many things, including war, family violence, and just the fact of moving and settling in another place. So provided we know the learner, of course, then I am taking I sort of expect my staff, therefore, to be developing a good relationship with them. So what I'd like to do is go through a student with you, and I'll try to do this as best I can. So the first thing to know about this student, I just want to give you a sense of who they are, is that they're from Iraq, 13 years old, has a couple of brothers, and has been in my school for about 1.5 years. Now, this student has had very Well, they now have 48 pages of chronicles, I can tell you, because I just downloaded them before, which means teachers have got onto Compass, because the chronicles, there'll probably be 3 per page. So there are a lot in a year and a half. And about 6 months ago, we did not have his behaviour under control, and he didn't have his behaviour under control. And the teachers were, some of them were feeling quite scared of him actually. But we worked very closely with them to really understand him and what his triggers are and how we could reduce them. And the way we did that was, one of the ways is by using this sort of behaviour escalation, what I would call a de-escalation map. And I'm pleased to tell you before we look at it that within 6 months he is going so well. He's able to articulate his needs, and it's not really a behavioural concern other than leaving the classroom occasionally without permission. So I don't know if you can you all see it well? It's hard for me to tell what you can see, but I'll just, okay, on the first part, you can see that we have the colours moving from green to yellow and through to red and then down to blue again. And that kind of corresponds to something called the zones of regulation, which I'm sure some of you may have seen in, especially in primary schools at the moment, that's around as a way of kids identifying how they're feeling, or teachers trying to help kids to identify how they're feeling and choosing a strategy to move them to another zone or get them to a good place. So the colours sort of map that. So at first it will say here, look, when he's calm, he'll be smiling and making eye contact and so forth. But then when we move on to agitated, he is becoming self-conscious and feels like he's sort of becoming like a bit paranoid, like feels like people are saying things about him, and he might start to speak to himself in his first language. And then when he gets to his peak, he may damage property in the room, get his bag and leave the room and so forth. And one time he did even leave the school. And then recovery is he re-engages with class. So sorry, I should really go to de-escalation, because he then sort of goes more or less to a bit of a crash, I guess, and shows that he is sad and withdrawn. And then he wants to talk with his peers, and he attempts to join in activities with the peers, but he doesn't want to discuss the stuff that happened that was bad with the teacher. So we had to learn to respect that, because often the teacher will go at that point and try and restore communication and relationship there, and wasn't a good time to do that with this child. And then in recovery, he will re-engage with the class and attempt the activity. He'll make eye contact again, he'll request peer support, and he'll look for opportunities to connect with other people. So by the team going through that task, they understood better what was happening, when, why, how, and what to do, and how, and what to expect, and how to get him down to recovery. So moving on, there's a whole page then for supports and interventions, which tells you things that have been negotiated with the student and discussed with him that will support him to get back to recovery. Okay, so he will, for example, he might say, oh, yes, I would like the support of an Arabic speaking adult from the school at this point, or I think I could do some colouring at this point, or I really need to leave the room and you need to let me leave the room, but we've negotiated where he will go. He won't just run off. Okay, and then there are sort of tips for teachers and CRTs and aides that work in the class in the last page, which describe each stage, think about the areas of focus, and think about the intervention tips for each of those stages of the escalation and de-escalation, which we're aiming for. Okay. Wow. There's 2 minutes to go, and I feel like I've been talking for about 2 minutes. I guess there's a lot in that, but the only other thing I wanted to add is that, of course, all of this is backed up by things that have already been discussed. School values, classroom agreements, restorative practice, and trying to use every opportunity as a teaching and learning moment. And also all of this has to fit in with what Foundation House is, an organisation that supports refugees, and they have recovery goals. And it has to fit in with that, because the recovery goals aim to, and this connects again a lot with what Patrice has discussed, having restoring safety, having calm and routine, giving dignity and voice back to the student, and giving them some meaning, respecting their identity and connection. So all of those bits sort of weave into that, but this is just one really detailed thing that I thought I'd share with you today, that sort of comes on the back of what do you do once you know which country your learner comes from. You might have to go really deep digging into the behaviour to understand it. So thanks.
Thank you, Mairead. That was so insightful. And I guess it's not just about knowing your learner, it's about knowing the context that they come from and knowing the context that you're teaching in as well. And that's so important to building a positive and supportive school environment for all students to learn in. I think it's nice, the different, the consistent messages that are coming across from the different speakers. So Zane, have we got any questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple. We've got Joel Renison has asked a question. Is there somewhere we can access the stages of behaviour escalation table?
Yeah, the Lookout Centre, they have a template like that. And if that fails, I can give it to Anne.
Thank you. We can put that up on the Moodle site.
And Mitzi has said she's got to head off, but thank you, and I'll check this all out later, but thank you. And Christian has said, thanks for the insight. We'll be aware to use the death stare only in the right environment.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's really interesting, thinking about the different contexts that we work in, and especially as pre-service teachers, you may go from one setting to a totally different setting for your placement experience and see totally, even though it's consistent across the different settings, there'll be different approaches to building a supportive and safe school environment.
Yeah, and I have used the death stare, everybody, just so you know. I just don't use it at this school.
Okay, thanks, Mairead. So Mairead will be staying on for a little bit longer. So if we have any questions at the end. Now we'll move on to Kristen, who's going to try and pull it all together for us and talk about restorative justice. Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you. I assume you can see my screen okay here?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. It's so lovely to be here, and I've just been taking furious notes for the past time here for the panelists who have spoken already. There's so many amazing insights, and like has been mentioned here, a lot of connections. So as Anne was just saying, I think one of the things that's coming out is just how crucial context is. And so that's depends on your school, it depends on your classroom, it depends on the particular learners that are in your classroom, it depends on you and what your own personality and values and strengths are. It depends on the age of the student. All of those things matter. And I think sort of my encouragement for you as teacher candidates is just to really be thinking about that and what this means for you. Like, what are the values? What are the principles? What are the core ideas that you can take, and then you interpret them with your students, with your colleagues, with your context, and it's going to look different from place to place. And so there's no cookie cutter way to do this stuff. but there are things that we can really engage in discussion. So my name is Kristen Reimer. I'm at Monash in the Faculty of Education. I do teach in the Masters of Teaching and also in the Bachelor's program and also in the Pathways program. And my background is in restorative justice. So my entry into teaching is from a restorative lens. It's also in all aspects of basically who I am. And so it is my research that I do. I'm from Canada. I started researching restorative justice in schools there, and now I do so in Australia. But it's also my own practice, my own way of teaching. And so when I teach at a university, I also teach using the restorative principles. And so again, it's that interpreting for the context. And so of course it looks different than it would in a primary school, and yet those principles are the same. And so I'm going to start, I'm having the same problem as Patrice did, so I'll do my trick. Yes, it worked. Start with a statement here, which is really at the core of, I think, of what everyone has really been talking about already here.
Kristen, we're not seeing the screen, I don't think.
You're not? Okay. Were you before?
No, we weren't. Just a blank, it's the blank blue Monash University screen.
Ah, that's not what you should have been seeing. No. Let's, one moment. Let's try this again. And how is that? Are you seeing that?
You're seeing your desktop at the moment?
Yeah. Okay. I'll try again. I'll move it to a different.
And maybe if anyone's got any questions, that could pop them in the chat box while we're.
Do you see something
there
now?
it goes.
Yeah, we're seeing the PowerPoint. Just set it up to start.
Good.
Yes.
Okay.
Children
right.
playing. Yes.
Yes. Okay. My apologies. And now you see it switch. We're good. Okay. Good. All right. So the statement to start off with here is that all education is relational, and as I was saying, that is something that's come across in all of the different presentations too, talking about knowing your learner, talking about relationships with parents and all of that. And so the relationships are, of course, between you and your students, but they're also between students. They're between you and your colleagues. They're between you and the families and within the community. But they're also the relationships between ideas, between your students and the world. So it's about seeing all of those different connections. So restorative justice is a relational framework. And that's what I mean too about this not being a cookie cutter kind of idea, but it's a framework to think about how can you help to create spaces in schools that are safe and supportive. And really at the fundamental core, it's about thinking about, what matters. What are the essential ties that bind us to one another? And how do we actually strengthen that? And so similar to what Patrice was saying, I would say it's not about behavior management, that the idea of management is sort of that external control over what someone is doing and how they're behaving. It is, as Patrice was saying, about support. And so restorative justice is focused on relationship development. And within that, our behaviors are part of our relationships. And so it's also about developing behaviors. And that, as Patrice was mentioning before, about that journey, that our students are on a journey, academically, relationally, emotionally, and so are we as adults. We're also on that journey as we figure these things out. So in schools, restorative justice has sort of three very interlocking ideas. So it's all focused on relationships. It's about building relationships. So about knowing your learners, knowing your colleagues, knowing yourself, and helping to create those connections that we've been hearing about. And then maintaining them so that once they're built, that you actually put in the time and effort to continually build that trust and to sustain them through your time together. And then when things happen, as they do, because we're human, it's about figuring out ways to repair those relationships. And so the values we've heard from Mairead and from Patrice and also from Jared and Cindy are really important to sort of recognize what are the values that underpin our work together. And for restorative justice, there's a belief that people are profoundly relational, that we are interconnected, and also that people are inherently good, that we start with that idea. And this is a diagram from Dorothy Vandering and Kathy Evans, who have a lovely little book, if you're interested in this, called The Little Book of Restorative Justice and Education. It's a great entry into restorative justice. And you'll see in the diagram at the center is that idea that all people are worthy and that we are all interconnected. And I mean, in some ways that's really common sense, but it's also in some ways quite radical to actually think about that with our relationships in schools, that every single person in that school community has worth, has value, is not disposable, and that we are all interconnected. And so we need to learn, and that's all of us, we need to learn ways of being together where we show that value and we value those connections. So you'll see those sort of the three values that are around there. So mutual respect, mutual dignity, and mutual concern. That kind of everything is sort of grounded in that. And then there's the three spheres in terms of how restorative justice plays out. So the top one there is nurturing healthy relationships, and that's really about that building and maintaining of relationships. And again, can happen in so many different ways. And I'm sure in your placements, you noticed many ways that that was happening. The second sphere there is about creating just and equitable learning environments. And so that is, you can have healthy relationships, but if you actually haven't thought through that learning climate, is it discriminatory? Is it safe for everybody? Is it, are there things that are happening that are actually pushing people out? You have to actually look at the environment as a whole in your classroom and in the school, because that needs to be a central part of those healthy relationships. They can't be separate. And then there's the repairing harm and transforming conflict. So you'll notice some different words there, that it's not about punishing the rule breaker, but it's a focus on harm and how do we actually do something about that. And then conflict, which is not inherently a bad thing. Conflict is an inevitable thing. How do we actually transform it into a learning experience? So restorative justice, you'll see, is both in many ways very proactive and then also responsive. And so it's about the building and maintaining the relationships, but then also the repairing part. So whether it's proactive or responsive, there are sort of four common elements that go throughout, and I'll just walk through those here. The first is that all practices are relational. The second is that in all processes that are restorative, you try to your best ability to involve all the people that are affected and focus on collaboration. The third is the focus on dialogue, on storytelling. And the fourth is that any interventions are, again, not focused on punishment, but they're focused on individual growth, relational growth, and community growth. And there could be healing as part of that too. So just briefly, and I forgot to look at the time when I started, so hopefully I'm all right. I'll just briefly go through kind of a little bit about what each of these could look like, both proactively and responsively. So the idea about practices being relational. So on the proactive side, of course, it's about getting to know, I'm thinking about students right now, getting to know your students, but having them getting to know each other too. And on a daily basis, just the simple ways that you show value for your students, but that you also encourage them showing value for one another. On the responsive side, so that when harm has occurred, when there is an incident, that you're actually thinking of the humans there, the people involved, and figuring out what the real needs are, not a set response to you've broken this rule, therefore this happens, but what actually needs to happen here. You know, how do we need to have the person who's been hurt? What do they need in order to feel safe, in order to feel whole, in order to feel that they can move on? And the person who has perhaps done the harm, what do they need in order to be to see what the impact of their actions are, and to also make different choices in the future and to be supported for that. The idea of processes involving all people affected. On the proactive side, that's about really seeing everyone as co-constructing our understandings. You know, we're all responsible to build that positive school climate. It's not something that teachers have to bring in and offer to students. Of course, it's a modeling, but it is a modeling of co-responsibility. And then I think Patrice was mentioning before about that teaching of explicitly. And so we can't just assume everyone knows how to collaborate. We need choices and chances to be taught explicitly, have it modeled implicitly, and then be practiced. And that can happen through the academics, through the class assignments. On the responsive side, it's about involving all those people who are affected, because they are the people that have the most information, the most expertise about what they actually need. And people respond the best when they're actually asked, what do you need? How can we deal with this? What's a mutually acceptable way forward? It's not that you leave it to them just to do on their own, but their voices are valued and considered as a very integral part of the process. In terms of the dialogue, again, it's that explicit teaching, that communication skills are so crucial. For us as teachers, listening skills, I would say, are one of the most crucial skills that we need to be able to really practice deep listening. Our students need that too. But also we also need to know how to articulate things for people to be able to hear them. And so we need to have that modeled, and we need to have that practiced. And so we often see circles with restorative processes. So classroom circles, get to know you circles, circles that are academics, circles that are dealing with incidents, all of those things where you're constantly practicing those skills. But then on the responsive side, the idea that when something's happened, we need to hear the stories. We need to hear all the perspectives, that we can't just make a decision or involve people in a decision without actually hearing the perspective and the needs. And then the idea of focusing really on the healing and the growth. And so in the proactive side, it's about always positioning mistakes as being necessary for learning. That so that people aren't ashamed of their mistakes, but are actually able to hold them and admit them and learn from them. And that we have accountability toward one another in sort of low risk interactions. So that then when there is a higher risk thing, when something does happen, you're more likely to actually engage and admit your role and your sense of accountability in it. And that to always send the message that there is no one disposable in this classroom. We do not throw people out. We are here. Yes, our actions do harm one another and we need to be accountable for those, but we do not toss people out of this place. And then the responsive side, again, it's about moving away from punishment and shaming and focusing on holding people accountable, meeting needs, bringing people back into relationship in a mutually acceptable manner. I'm almost finished here. So I just want to go, there's sort of some typical restorative questions, and I'm giving you a very quick little overview here, but I do want to just show sometimes the difference. You can see when you look at some of the typical questions that you might ask with a punitive approach, which is really about focusing on who did it and what rule did they break, what do they deserve, and what can we do to stop them from doing it again? And those are understandable questions. We don't want people to keep on doing the same things. But what you can see with punishment, when you look at typical punishment responses, is that they don't actually get people to stop doing what we want them to stop doing. We don't actually get to the long-term solutions. You might stop things in the short term, but there's not the understanding of the impact. There's not the holding yourself accountable and thinking through in a longer term way what your actions are and how you want to be. And so the restorative questions are more starting off with what happened. And that's really the storytelling opening. And there's no blame, it's simply what happened. What were you thinking and feeling at the time? What are you thinking and feeling now? Who's been affected? In what ways? What needs to happen to put things right again? Or what needs to happen to fix things? And how can we support you in that? And so it's a much more dialogical, conversational approach. And I do want to pick up, both Mairead and Patrice mentioned this too, is just that journey that often we do put that false separation between academic and social learning. And all of the skills that you need for restorative justice are also the skills that you need for any type of learning, for any academics. You need listening, curiosity, inquiry, respect, accountability, engagement. We are modeling and teaching both, but I think they're also just so interconnected that it serves us well to see those interconnections. And just finally, if you're curious about knowing more, I've started a website this year looking at restorative schools in Australia, because Australia was actually the first place in the world to use restorative justice in schools. And it started about 25 years ago. And so I'm starting to do profiles of schools across Australia that use restorative justice in holistic sort of ways. And so there's one video that's up there right now of a lovely school from Queensland, just a 5-minute video. And COVID stopped me, but I have a Victoria school lined up that I'm looking to do in the next couple of months. So I will leave it there. And I hope I wasn't too far over time, Anne.
No, thank you so much, Kristen. I think it was lovely to get that. It's a philosophical as well as pedagogical approach to creating safe and supportive environments. And I think it pulls together a lot of the principles and practices that the other presenters shared with us tonight. So what a powerful panel of presentations. It got me thinking about so many things. And when you were talking about circles, I remember when I was working in early special education, and we used to talk about having circles of friends for children with differing needs. So that sort of brought back that idea to me, that notion of helping students with the relational, and sometimes doing that by creating circles or helping them to create circles of friends. So has